Yo, what is good, dev guys? Welcome back. In this video, I want to fix the issue with the inputs. Now, I did receive a message in the comments saying that someone fixed the issue with the inputs by changing the trigger for the action to actually sprint. They changed the trigger here to hold. Now, we'll take a look at this and see how it happens. And see what happens when you do this. And this could be a good solution for this, but I also want to show you the other side of things. Like if you had more advanced input, maybe this wouldn't solve that issue. So I want to show you that as well. So I am going to change this to hold. I'm gonna save this. And one thing that I do want to do is one, test this, and then two, turn off the audio from the actual game. So if I go into options here and let me go into audio, and I just want to turn down the music, and that'll be good for now. We'll apply that, go back, and now let's see if I hold down shift. See, but now since I'm doing hold, my input release function is not following. Well, actually, it is working. I'm sorry. So if I hold down sprint, I start sprinting, and then if I hold it down again, I stop sprinting with a little jitter there because of the lag. So that actually does work for the toggle sprint, but let's change it to a hold sprint real fast. So I'm gonna go back to where I have this ability. I believe it's in input, abilities, and we're looking for sprint. So instead of doing this wait input press, I'm gonna say wait input release, and let's go ahead and pass it through here instead. And on release, we want to end the ability, and let me just make sure I get a notification that I ended the ability. So if we go through and test this, you see that it's still happening. With hold, my input is still quote unquote being released. And the reason for that is if we go to the actual code, and I'm going to stop this project. If we go to the actual code, clear this, inside of this input component, if you go to Lyra game input and navigate to the input component.h, and I'm gonna right click on this and close other tabs, and then Alt O to open up the .cpp file. So if you navigate to here, there's a function in here that binds the ability actions here. It's using the template function, taking in a user class. It takes in a type name for a press function type and a type name for a release function type. If you want to learn more about templates or templated functions, I suggest navigating to Sneaky Kitty's YouTube channel. Very good C++ programmer here. He has a computer science 101 course that he's doing right now. And one thing that he covered is template functions. So definitely check that out. But moving on, so they use this template function to pass in a name for these binding functions to these different binding actions. So if we control click into this bind ability action, it goes and iterates over the different ability input actions. So that's coming from the input config. I'll dive deeper into that in a second. Basically, what we're doing is what you would do in an input component or your setup input actions inside of the character class. You would bind an action, you'd use the F name of the action, then you'd give it the event that you want to bind to, whether it's released or pressed, but in enhanced input, these are different. This right here is very deep. Like they wrapped this into like 3 different classes. It took me a while to figure out, trickle down this stuff. I won't try to cover it in this video. If you have any questions and I could possibly answer them, please just don't hesitate to go into the Discord and jump into like the general channel or anything like that and just ask away. So if we control click on this trigger event, we'll see here that triggered, it has a little bit of information here. It says triggering occurred after one or more processing ticks. So this happens when the actual input is triggered. There's also a started. This basically happens when you start pressing the input. Ongoing means that I'm still holding down the input, and canceled means that I canceled the input. I tried using this, but it didn't work. And I would show it, but it's pointless to show that why it wouldn't work. And completed is pretty much whenever this input action has triggered and is done. Completed is not when you release the key. Completed is when the input is triggered and is done triggering. That is the completed state of that input. It completes after it's done triggering. That's why when we use the wait input release task inside the gameplay ability gets fired almost instantly, it's because the input is triggered and then it's completed. And if you look here, we're binding the release function to the completed event. So some of our inputs, and I need to renew my rider license. Some of my inputs, they need to kind of think a little bit better about what released actually is. So we want to still keep this because there are some inputs where we won't wait on the release. We'll just wait on the trigger, and the release function won't really matter. But for other inputs, we want to kind of bind smarter to the input. So what I'm going to do is navigate to here, and we're going to copy this entire 2 lines here. So copy, and let's shift enter and paste this here. And instead of calling this bind ability actions, we're going to say bind advanced ability actions. So I'm going to implement this, and let's go ahead and fix this formatting. So inside of here, we want to do the same thing. We want to get these input config ability actions, and whichever ones we decide, and we want to iterate over them and bind actions to the inputs released and triggered events. But inside this input config, it only has the ability actions. And I guess I should have kept the editor open to show where this is, but I'll show you in a second. So if we navigate to this Lyra input config, this holds a T array of input actions for the native input actions. It holds a T array for the ability input actions. And we also wanted to hold a T array for the different input actions that we deem the advanced actions that need to think a little bit better. Okay, so these advanced ability actions will be the ones that really do depend on the input being pressed as one state and released as another state. So back to the header file where we need to be. Let's go ahead and pretty much copy all of this because we want to do the exact same thing. We just want to do it a little bit smarter. So what I'm going to do is, instead of using this ability input actions, I'm going to use my advanced ability input actions. And the press function, instead of binding it to the triggered state, I want to bind it to the started state. And the release function, instead of binding it to the completed state, I want to bind it to the triggered state. And you'll see when we hop in the editor why I'm doing this. After we do that, let's find where this bind ability actions function is being called, because wherever this function is being called, we want to also call this function. So let's go ahead and right click on this and say find usages. And you see here it's being used in the hero component where we bind the ability actions here to our input component. So let's just jump over to that class here. And what we want to do is do the same thing right here. We want to basically copy this. Let's shift enter and let's paste this and say advanced bind handles. And then we want to get that Lyra input component and we want to say bind ability actions, but we want to use the advanced ability actions. We want to give it our input config. We want to give it this object. And here's that press function. This press function is the function on this class called input ability input tag press. If you go here, basically it just sends a message to our ability system component that we are pressing input down with this input tag. You're kind of seeing how all these things are firing. Like I said, this system alone is like wrapped up in 5 different. You see, I got 1, 2, 3, 4 different components open here, 4 different classes open. So, and it's wrapped even deeper than that. But yeah, we want to give it the same function here. And pretty much what I could do is save myself some typing, and let's copy this and paste that puppy right inside of here. And I'm going to double click on this to get more space. Let's go ahead in the line there, but instead of bind handles, we want to do advanced bind handles. Now I need to continue looking to where this function has been implemented at. So it's implemented twice inside of this class. So if we navigate to the second place it's implemented in, we are adding additional input configs. So this is in the case where we might add an additional input config, and I'll give a more exact example when we hop in the editor because it's going to be pointless to explain it. It's really a visual thing. So let's just go ahead and copy this function. And what we want to do is make a T array of these UN32s. Call this advanced bind handles, and we want to pass that here. And instead of doing bind ability actions, we want to bind advanced. And pretty much whenever we add an additional input config, this will run as well. We want to always make sure we're binding our advanced input actions. That way, if we have any, they function properly. So with all of that, we have now pretty much covered all of our bases, and we can go ahead and run the editor. Okay, so that compiled successfully without any errors. Now, what we want to do is let's just demonstrate this additional input config. So I'm gonna go to my plugins folder, shooter core, and let's go ahead and look for input data. So if you look at this input data class, you see that the native class is a Lyra input config. Now this input data gets added on to our original input data. You see here, it even says add-ons. So we have a default input data, and then we have this input data as well. And that's where that function where we go ahead and add an additional input config, where this runs, that's specifically for when you have a game feature or a different game mode that adds different inputs specific to that game mode. That way we can keep our original inputs and also consecutively add inputs on top without destroying any of the inputs that were binded before an additional input was added. So here we got the shooter game add-ons, but we really don't need that one. I think we need to navigate to our hero. I think it's input data, and it's for our hero. This is where we originally binded our sprint. You see here, it's bound to our ability input actions. We actually want to take this and delete it, and we want to move it to the advanced ability input actions. So here we're going to use that sprint, and then we're going to use the sprint input tag as well. And now for the mapping of this, we want to change it. And this is where the reasoning behind using the started and the triggered as the different pressed and released functions. So if we go to input, so content, input, let's go to the mappings and let's go to keyboard and mouse and let's look for that sprint. I'm going to close this, open it, and we got sprint down here. Right now it has no triggers. Wait, it has a press trigger. So when we were doing this originally, we were just binding regularly. We would press, and whenever we reached the actuation threshold, our input would trigger and then it would be complete. And that's why every time we waited on an input to be released, it will fire in the same frame as if it was triggered. But what we want to do is use hold and release. So hold and release, it triggers or it starts once you hold the button down. When you release the button, that's when it triggers. So that's why we binded our different events to started and released. So I'm going to change it to this hold and release. Our hold time threshold, we don't want it to be that high because we want to start sprinting instantly. So let's do like 0.025 or something like that. And the actuation threshold, we can do it like 0.1 or something like that. And pretty much we've fixed the issue, but let's go ahead and test it here. Make sure it all works correctly. So now when I sprint and I hold down my sprint, you see that that issue is not popping up. We're not ending our sprint until we release. Oh, and that is a bug there. I'm seeing that that's not working how I intended it. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna navigate to my, let's navigate to my sprint ability, input, abilities, sprint. So we're waiting on the input to be pressed because I didn't save here. So let me go ahead and say wait, input, release. And let's go ahead and get in there, and on release, let's do that. And let's also do the same thing. I don't know why that didn't save. Print string. Do I have? Oh, I don't have save on compile. I usually use this all the time. I save on compile always because as you notice, my muscle memory is not to compile and save. My muscle memory is just to compile. That's why that didn't save. So let's say sprinting ability ended, just to make sure. So I'm gonna compile, that will save automatically. And now we can do a real test. So when I'm holding down my sprint, we don't get that message until I let go of my sprint key. Right here, I'm holding my sprint key and I let go of my sprint key. And of course, we're getting that little lag there. What I'm gonna do so that it is very bothering to the eye, I'm gonna go to our, I think it's inside of here. Let's go to emulation and let's just go ahead and remove this network emulation for now. That way it's smooth. So here we start sprinting and then I let go, we stop sprinting, and just keep on testing this because it's very, you want to make sure no bugs happen. So I'm holding sprint down and jumping around, hopping almost. And I let go of my sprint key and we stop sprinting. So that's exactly the functionality that we want. I'm gonna go ahead and stop that. What you will see with this is that different functions that they have set up, like the firing ability, it's literally firing the ability over and over and over and over and over and over. So we're going to fix that. But before we jump into that, I want to show you guys how to set up your own settings. So if I press play here, I want to show you how to set up your own settings. So let's go to options and let's look at our mouse and keyboard. And here we have some settings to invert the vertical axis and invert the horizontal axis and do all these other things. I want to show you how to set up an additional option here to toggle sprint and to toggle aim. That way we give the player the option to use those features as they see fit. I'm a player who uses toggle sprint and I use toggle aim. So we want to also give our players the option to do that. So I'm gonna show you how to set that up and pull from that information to actually use it inside your gameplay ability. So if you guys are ready for that, I'll see you in the next video. Peace.